There is a moment most people in this generation have had at least once. It arrives during something unremarkable, a stretch of downtime, a conversation that just ended, the particular quiet of a Sunday that should feel open, when you catch a glimpse of a pattern you have been running for so long that it stopped registering as a choice. Not a personality trait. Not something you would include in a description of yourself at a dinner table. A strategy. Something assembled by your nervous system at a point you cannot precisely locate in memory when it needed to decide how to operate inside a set of conditions it could not control. The strategy worked, or at least worked well enough to keep running. That is why it is still running. And the moment you catch it clearly enough to name, it is almost always the first time it occurs to you that the pattern was built for specific conditions, and that those conditions may have shifted in ways the pattern hasn't fully registered yet. If you're anywhere in the Gen Z window, those original conditions were, in their essential architecture, the same for your entire cohort. The same platform structures, the same compressed economic signals absorbed through household conversations you felt before you could interpret them. The same real-time, high-resolution exposure to institutional systems performing under pressure during the years that were supposed to be opening rather than accounting. The same ambient signal about the future arriving with decreasing confidence the older you got. Not as content you elected to consume, but as information absorbed the way children absorb what the adults around them are quietly worried about, through tone and repetition and the specific tension in a room that nobody is naming directly, but everyone can feel. The conditions were not identical in every household, but the architecture was shared, and shared architecture, applied to millions of nervous systems with different baseline sensitivities, produces something that decades of stress research have mapped with considerable precision. A small number of measurably distinct adaptive patterns that account for the full range of behavioral outputs. Not a personality spectrum, not infinite variation. 3 primary clusters, differentiated not by who you fundamentally are, but by a single underlying variable that determined where your nervous system landed. Here's what nobody calls it precisely enough. The variable is not character. It is not resilience or the quality of your parents or some innate feature of your emotional architecture, though all of those things interact with it. The variable that differentiates the 3 patterns is, according to stress researcher Bruce McEwen's decades of work on allostatic load, the cumulative biological cost of sustained environmental demand, how long a given nervous system waits for a chronic, unresolvable stressor to resolve before reclassifying it as permanent and reconfiguring its operating parameters accordingly. That reclassification point is different for every nervous system, and the 3 behavioral clusters that emerge from it, documented across species, replicated across cultures, consistent across decades of research, are not theoretical constructs. They are 3 ways that the same organism, facing the same sustained input, produces 3 different but internally coherent adaptations. You are in one of them. There is no 4th type, and you landed where you did not because of who you fundamentally are, but because of when your system ran out of runway, waiting for the conditions to change. Picture this. Is 2014. 3 kids in the same school, the same grade, running through the same feed on their phones every night. The same economic undercurrent from 2008 still present in their households in the way that economic anxiety is present in a house. As a particular quality of certain conversations, a specific way doors close, a mood rather than a clearly explained fact. The same social media architecture now deeply embedded in the social dynamics of their peer group, providing the feedback loop that adolescent brains are specifically calibrated to monitor and delivering it at a resolution, a velocity, and a permanence that no previous generation's development had been shaped by. The first kid responds to the ambient, unresolvable pressure by intensifying performance. If the environment is uncertain, you become the variable that compensates. More output, more control over the presentation, more visible evidence that someone here is managing this. The second kid runs a different calculation. If investment in an unstable environment produces costs that consistently outweigh the returns, the rational available response is to reduce exposure. Contract. Build something interior that the external environment cannot destabilize. The third kid continues to function externally, while something internal quietly uncouples from the outcomes of that functioning. The presentation continues. The investment behind it recalibrates to the level that the evidence suggests is proportionate to what investment there actually delivers. 3 kids, same year, same architecture, 3 different but internally coherent decisions about how to operate inside it. The first pattern, what researchers studying achievement motivation under chronic uncertainty have documented across multiple studies spanning more than 2 decades, produces the zoomer who looks from the outside like someone who has it managed, and from the inside has been managing a threat for longer than anyone around them knows. Research in developmental and social psychology has consistently found that one subgroup responds to environmental instability by intensifying visible performance investment, not from internal drive in the conventional sense, but from a specific working theory of control. If the conditions I am navigating are uncertain, what I can control is the quality and legibility of my output. This is the zoomer who is building systems and frameworks before anyone asks them to, who documents the execution because the documentation is itself a signal to the environment, to other people, possibly to themselves, that someone here is on top of it. What the longitudinal research on this pattern consistently shows is that the maintenance cost accumulates differently from genuine engagement. Genuine engagement depletes and replenishes with rest. Threat management depletes against a floor that stays elevated because the thing being managed, the ambient structural uncertainty that activated the strategy in the first place, never actually resolved in a way that allowed the strategy to stand down. The accelerator isn't depleted from doing too much. They're depleted from the sustained cognitive and emotional work of performing competence inside an environment that hasn't provided a natural exit condition for the performance. The second pattern is less visible from the outside, which means it is both less studied and more poorly characterized when it does appear in the literature. Research on adolescent social withdrawal has long differentiated between avoidance driven by social anxiety and withdrawal driven by genuine preference for solitude. 2 states with different mechanisms, different outcomes, and different interventions that frequently get conflated because they produce similar behavior from the outside. What Gen Z retreating often reflects is a third variant: withdrawal as rational cost-benefit assessment of a specific risk environment. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, whose research on social connection has been cited in the U.S. Surgeon General's Advisory on Loneliness and Isolation, distinguishes carefully between isolation as deprivation and solitude as resource. But the Gen Z retreater's pattern often belongs to neither category exactly. What it reflects is a calculation about the risk architecture of social investment inside an environment where the feedback mechanisms were structurally different from anything previous cohorts had navigated at the same developmental stage. Early social media adolescence, with its permanent records, real-time visibility metrics, and the specific amplification of ordinary social stakes, to potential audience sizes that adolescent brains were not built to process calmly, with genuinely higher costs than what previous generations faced. The retreater's original calculation was, in many cases, accurate. What matters now is whether the calculation is still running on the model it built in 2014 or whether it has access to updated inputs from the actual environments the retreater is currently choosing. And here is the third pattern, the one that is most persistently mislabeled as the thing it isn't. Psychologist Martin Seligman's foundational research on learned helplessness, developed in the late 1960s and extended across decades of subsequent investigation by Seligman and numerous follow-on researchers, identified the specific state a nervous system produces after sustained experience of environments where outcomes are consistently decoupled from inputs. A progressive reduction in investment that is not apathy in the emotional sense, but a rational updating of behavior based on accumulated evidence. When effort and outcome have been sufficiently disconnected across enough time, the nervous system's protective function adjusts investment downward. Not because caring has stopped, but because the existing model has been updated with consistent data showing that conventional investment channels are not producing returns proportionate to their cost. The detacher still perceives still has preferences. Still, if you could see inside the operating logic clearly, cares about the things they appear not to care about, the institutional systems, the futures that were promised and didn't materialize, the civic structures that request confidence they haven't earned. What has been revised is the model of whether expressing that care through the available channels is supported by the evidence those channels have been producing. This is not nihilism. It is a conclusion that has been accumulating across a decade's worth of data points, produced by a generation that is running pattern recognition at an unusually high level of precision. In the absence of a name for it that doesn't also assign a pathology is part of why detachers rarely trust the available diagnoses of what is happening to them. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If you recognize yourself in one of those patterns, and if you are honest with the descriptions, the recognition probably arrived before you finished reading them. The first thing worth holding is that what you recognized was not a verdict on your character. It was an architecture, something a nervous system built during a specific developmental window, processing real conditions, using the best available logic it had at the time with the resources available to it. The accelerator is not depleted because of some fundamental defect in their relationship to rest or effort. They are depleted because the management function they have been running was built without a natural exit condition, because the thing it was built to manage never resolved in a way that allowed the function to stand down. Recognizing the function for what it is, rather than treating it as intrinsic motivation that simply needs more optimization or better habits, changes what you are actually trying to address. The retreater is not unavailable because something went wrong with them socially. They made an accurate assessment of a high-stakes environment and built something interior that was more reliable than the exterior that prompted the construction. The question available to them now is not whether the withdrawal was rational. But whether the current environments they're choosing carry the same cost structure as the ones they originally left, or whether the model is operating on outdated inputs. The detacher is not indifferent. They updated their investment model on evidence. The intervention that actually engages that pattern is not an inspiration campaign or a call to simply care more. It is new data that contradicts the existing model, arriving in forms concrete and traceable enough that the pattern recognition machinery this generation runs so fluently has something real to process. Knowing which type you are changes what you are actually trying to fix. That is not a small thing. Most of what gets offered to Gen Z as solutions addresses the surface behavior without touching the mechanism that produces it, which is why it doesn't work. The pattern you recognized just now was built with a logic that becomes legible when you can see the conditions that produced it. That understanding doesn't erase the pattern, but it makes revision possible in a way that self-judgment or anyone else's judgment never has and never will. Which type are you? Say it in the comments. Not as a label to carry, but because seeing how many people arrived at the same cluster under the same conditions usually changes how permanent the pattern feels. And if you know someone running a strategy that no longer fits the environment they are actually in, without a way to name what the strategy is, send this without commentary. Sometimes the mechanism is the only thing that was missing. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.